The community center on Maple Street wasn't fancy. It had those fluorescent lights that buzzed slightly and linoleum floors that squeaked when you walked too fast. But for Claire, it was exactly what she needed. After moving to this small town 3 months ago, she'd spent most of her time unpacking boxes and trying to make their new house feel like home. Her husband's job transfer had been sudden, and while she was happy for him, she felt a bit lost in this unfamiliar place where she didn't know anyone. So when she saw the flyer for an adult music appreciation class at the local community center, something inside her sparked. Music. She could use that. Not for any particular reason. Just to have something to do on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Maybe meet some people. Keep her mind occupied. The first class was on a Tuesday evening in September. Claire arrived 15 minutes early, wearing jeans and a simple sweater she'd owned for years. She'd never been one to dress up much. Growing up, her mother always said that fancy clothes were wasteful, and the habit had stuck. She carried a worn notebook she'd found in a drawer at home and a pen from the bank. The classroom was actually a converted, multi-purpose room with chairs arranged in a semicircle facing a piano and a projector screen. Claire chose a seat in the middle row, not too far back but not right up front either. Other students trickled in slowly. There was an older gentleman with thick glasses who looked like he might be retired. A young couple who couldn't have been more than 25 sat together holding hands. A woman about Claire's age with perfectly styled hair and expensive-looking jewelry took a seat in the front row, already chatting loudly about her experience attending the opera in New York. The instructor walked in precisely at 6 o'clock. Professor David Reynolds, according to the nameplate he set on the table beside the piano. He was probably in his late 50s, wearing a tweed jacket with elbow patches that seemed almost like a costume. His salt and pepper beard was neatly trimmed, and he carried himself with the kind of confidence that comes from years of being the smartest person in the room. "Good evening," he began, his voice carrying easily across the space. "Welcome to Music Appreciation 101. I'm Professor Reynolds, and I've been teaching music theory and history for 32 years. I hope you're all here because you have a genuine interest in learning about the great composers and their works. Not just because you need an easy elective," he paused, looking around the room with an expression that suggested he'd already assessed each person's potential. Claire shifted slightly in her seat. Something about his tone made her want to be invisible. "Let's go around the room. Tell me your name and your experience with music. Any instrument you've played, concerts you've attended, that sort of thing." The older gentleman went first. He'd played trumpet in his high school band 40 years ago and wanted to learn more about classical music. Professor Reynolds nodded approvingly. The young couple had no musical background at all, but loved listening to movie soundtracks. The professor's lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing. Then it was the talkative woman's turn. "I'm Patricia," she announced with enthusiasm. "I'm a retired high school English teacher, and I've been attending concerts for years. I saw Yo-Yo Ma perform once, and it was absolutely transcendent. I've always wanted to understand music on a deeper level, you know? Really appreciate what the composers were trying to communicate." "Excellent," Professor Reynolds said, actually smiling. "It's wonderful to have someone with cultural exposure in the class." A few more students introduced themselves. Most were beginners or casual listeners. Then the professor's eyes landed on Claire. "And you?" "I'm Claire," she said quietly. "I just moved here a few months ago. I thought this would be a nice way to, meet people and learn something new." "Any musical background?" "I know a little piano. I took lessons when I was younger." "How long ago?" Claire hesitated. She didn't want to explain everything, didn't want to go into details. "A while ago. I mostly just remember bits and pieces." Professor Reynolds nodded dismissively, already looking at the next student. Claire could tell he'd mentally filed her away as another beginner, someone who'd probably taken a few childhood lessons and could maybe pick out "Mary Had a Little Lamb" with one finger. The class continued with a lecture about the Baroque period. Professor Reynolds spoke passionately about Bach and Handel, occasionally playing recordings and asking students to identify different instruments. Patricia raised her hand frequently, offering observations that were enthusiastic if not particularly insightful. The professor praised her engagement. At one point, while discussing Chopin's etudes, Professor Reynolds made a small mistake. He said Chopin had written 27 etudes when Claire knew there were actually 27 in the two major opus sets. but Chopin had written additional etudes beyond those. It was a tiny detail, the kind of thing only someone deeply familiar with Chopin's work would catch. Claire opened her mouth slightly, then closed it. What was the point? It would seem like she was showing off, and besides, who was she to correct a professor with 32 years of experience? She simply wrote a small note in her worn notebook and continued listening. After class, Patricia approached several students, including Claire. That was fascinating, wasn't it? I just love learning about the historical context of music. Did you know that Chopin had a relationship with George Sand? I read a biography about it. That's interesting, Claire said politely. You're very quiet, Patricia observed, not unkindly. Are you shy? I used to have shy students in my classes. I always tried to draw them out. I'm just more of a listener, I guess. Well, don't be intimidated by all this. Music is for everyone, not just experts. Even if you only remember a few piano lessons from childhood, you can still appreciate the beauty of it all. Claire smiled. You're right, thanks. Walking to her car afterward, Claire felt a familiar mixture of emotions. Part of her had enjoyed the class. It was nice to be around music again, even if just listening to recordings and discussing history. But another part of her felt strangely invisible. Not in a bad way exactly, more like she was watching her own life from a distance. The next class was similar. Professor Reynolds lectured, Patricia enthusiastically participated, and Claire took notes quietly in the back. Once the professor asked if anyone had questions about sonata form, and when no one raised their hand, he sighed and said, "This is challenging material. Don't worry if it doesn't make sense right away. Most people need years to truly understand these concepts." Claire understood it perfectly. She'd been analyzing sonata form since she was 15. But she kept that to herself, just like she kept so many other things to herself these days. By the third week, she'd settled into a comfortable routine. She was the quiet one in the back who never caused trouble and never stood out. Professor Reynolds barely noticed her. Patricia had befriended her in a surface-level way, chatting before and after class about nothing particularly important. The other students regarded her as just another person in the room. It was exactly what Claire wanted. After everything that had happened in her previous life, all the attention and pressure and constant judgment, being nobody felt like a relief. She had no idea that was about to change. The announcement came during the fourth week of class, right after a long lecture about Romantic-era composers. Professor Reynolds stood by the piano with a stack of papers in his hand, and there was something about his expression that made Claire's stomach tighten. "Before you all leave today, I need to discuss an important component of this course," he began, adjusting his glasses. "I believe that true appreciation of music requires more than just passive listening. You need to understand the difficulty, the artistry, the dedication required to perform these masterpieces." Patricia leaned forward in her seat, eager as always. The young couple exchanged nervous glances. "Therefore, each of you will be required to perform a musical piece in front of the class. This performance will account for 40% of your final grade." The room erupted in murmurs. The retired gentleman raised his hand immediately. "Professor, I haven't touched a trumpet in decades. I don't even own one anymore." "Then I suggest you borrow one or choose a different instrument," Professor Reynolds replied coolly. "This is a college-level course, even if it is community education. I have standards." Claire felt her heart sink. She hadn't expected this. When she signed up for a music appreciation class, she thought it would be lectures and listening, not performing, not standing in front of people and playing. "For those of you with limited experience, I've prepared a list of acceptable beginner pieces," the professor continued, passing around sheets of paper. "Mozart's easier sonatas, some simple Beethoven bagatelles, basic etudes by Czerny. Choose something within your skill level." Claire looked at the list when it reached her. These weren't really beginner pieces, not in the true sense. They were simplified classical works that would still challenge someone who had only had a few years of childhood lessons. But for most of the class, they would be incredibly difficult. Around her, students were already panicking. A woman in her 40s who'd admitted she'd never played an instrument looked close to tears. "Can we choose something modern? Like a simple pop song?" "Absolutely not," Professor Reynolds said firmly. "This is a classical music appreciation course. You will perform classical works, or you will not pass." After class, Claire approached the professor's desk. Her hands were shaking slightly, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe it was anxiety about performing, maybe it was something else. Professor Reynolds, I was looking at the list and I was thinking the Mozart Sonata in C major might be appropriate for me. He glanced up from organizing his papers, barely looking at her. The K545, that's already been selected by another student. First come, first served, I'm afraid. Oh, okay. Maybe the Beethoven, also taken. He shuffled through a separate stack of papers, frowning. Let me see. With your limited background, you'll need something that can be performed adequately, even with mistakes. However, I do think it's important to challenge yourself. He ran his finger down a different list, one that hadn't been distributed to the class. Claire noticed these pieces were more advanced. Much more advanced. Here we are, he said, writing something on a form. Liszt's La Campanella. Do you know it? Claire's breath caught in her throat. Of course she knew it. Every serious pianist knew it. It was one of the most technically demanding pieces in the entire piano repertoire, nicknamed the Little Bell for the way it mimicked the sound of bells. The piece required enormous handspans, lightning-fast passages, and incredible precision. Concert pianists prepared for months to perform it. Professor, I don't think that's appropriate for my skill level, Claire said carefully. It's extremely difficult. He waved his hand dismissively, still not really looking at her. Mrs. Mitchell, I've been teaching for over 3 decades. I know what I'm doing. You said you had piano lessons as a child, correct? This will be an excellent learning experience for you. Sometimes we grow most when we're pushed beyond our comfort zones. But that piece requires— I'm not expecting perfection, he interrupted, finally looking at her directly. His expression was one of patient condescension, like a parent explaining something to a slow child. This is an educational exercise. You'll practice as much as you can, and you'll perform whatever portion you're able to complete. The attempt is what matters. The struggle itself will teach you to appreciate what professional pianists accomplish. Claire stood there, her form clenched in her hand. She could push back harder, she could explain, but what would she say? That she'd actually performed this piece in concert halls? That she'd recorded it for an album that sold thousands of copies? That she'd once played it for a crowd of 3,000 people in Berlin? You have 3 weeks, Professor Reynolds said, turning back to his papers. I suggest you start practicing immediately, and Claire? He glanced up again. Don't be discouraged if you can only manage the first page or 2. That's perfectly acceptable given your background. Claire walked out of the classroom in a daze. In the parking lot, Patricia caught up with her, slightly out of breath. Can you believe he's making us perform? I'm terrified. I chose a simple Bach prelude, but even that is going to be challenging. What did you get assigned? La Campanella, Claire said quietly. Patricia's eyes widened. The Liszt piece? Oh no, that's not fair at all. That's one of the hardest piano pieces ever written. Why would he give you that? He thinks it will be educational. Educational? That's cruel. Patricia shook her head. You should talk to someone, the department head or something. He can't just set you up to fail like that. It's fine, Claire said, though her mind was racing. I'll figure it out. Driving home, Claire gripped the steering wheel tightly. She thought about all the reasons she'd left her old life behind. The pressure had been suffocating. Every performance reviewed, every note scrutinized. The competitions, the constant comparison to other pianists, the expectation to always be brilliant. And then her daughter Lily had been born with a rare autoimmune disorder, requiring constant medical attention and care. The choice had been easy, really. Her child's health versus her career. No contest. She'd given up the performance circuit without regret. She'd sold her grand piano and bought a simple upright for their home. She'd stopped performing, stopped competing, stopped being that pianist. For 11 years, she'd been just a mother, a wife, a normal person. The music was still there, living inside her, but it was private now. Hers, alone. And now this professor, who couldn't even be bothered to look at her properly, had assigned her one of the most difficult pieces in existence as some kind of teaching tool. He'd looked at her worn clothes and quiet demeanor and assumed she was nobody. Assumed she'd struggle through half a page and give up. At home, she found her husband making dinner. How was class? Interesting, she said, setting her bag down. We have to perform. He turned from the stove, wooden spoon in hand. Perform? Like in front of people? In front of the class. Everyone has to do it. What are you going to play? She laughed, but it didn't sound quite right. He assigned me La Campanella. Her husband stared at her. He'd been there through everything, through her career, through the decision to leave it behind, through the years of medical appointments and sleepless nights with Lily. He knew exactly what that piece meant. You're kidding. Nope. He thinks it will be a good learning experience for someone of my limited skill level. What are you going to do? That was the question, wasn't it? Claire walked to their living room where the upright piano sat against the wall. She hadn't played anything challenging in months. Lately it had just been simple melodies, songs that made Lily smile when she came home from school. She sat on the bench and lifted the fallboard. Her fingers found the keys automatically, muscle memory from thousands of hours of practice. She played the opening notes of La Campanella softly, so softly that her husband barely heard it from the kitchen. The piece unfolded under her fingers like a map of a country she used to live in. Every passage was familiar. Every difficult leap, every delicate trill, every thundering run. Her hands remembered even though her mind had tried to forget. You've still got it, her husband said from the doorway. Claire stopped playing and looked at her hands. She'd kept her nails short for practical reasons, for taking care of Lily. She didn't wear rings anymore because her fingers had swollen slightly after her daughter was born, and they never quite went back. These weren't the hands of a concert pianist anymore. They were the hands of a mother who made school lunches and braided hair and signed permission slips, but they could still play. That much was obvious. I don't know what to do, she admitted. If I play it well, everyone will know. The professor, the class, everyone. And then it all comes back. The questions, the attention, the expectations. And if you don't? Then I fail the class. And I feel like I'm letting myself down somehow. Her husband came and sat beside her on the bench. You don't have to prove anything to that professor. You already know who you are. Do I? Claire asked softly. Sometimes I'm not sure anymore. She closed the fallboard and went to help with dinner. But later that night, after her husband was asleep, she went back downstairs and played the piece again, all the way through, in the darkness with only the streetlight coming through the window. Her fingers remembered everything. The next 3 weeks passed in a strange blur. During the day, Claire was the same as always. She made breakfast for Lily, packed her lunch with the crusts cut off the sandwiches just how she liked them, drove her to school, and picked her up in the afternoon. She helped with homework and made dinner and did laundry. A normal life. A quiet life. But at night, after everyone was asleep, something shifted. She'd wait until she heard her husband's breathing become deep and steady. She'd check on Lily one more time, pulling the blanket up over her daughter's shoulders and watching her chest rise and fall. Then she'd creep downstairs in her pajamas and socks, careful to avoid the creaky step third from the bottom. The piano waited in the darkness. She never turned on the overhead light. Just a small lamp on the side table, casting a warm glow across the keys. And then she'd play. The first night, her fingers were stiff, uncertain. She'd played simple things for so long that the complex passages of La Campanella felt foreign, like speaking a language she'd once been fluent in, but had half forgotten. She stumbled through the opening, hitting wrong notes, her timing off. By the second night, things started coming back. The muscle memory was still there, buried under years of ordinary life. Her hands began to remember the enormous leaps across the keyboard, the way her wrist needed to rotate for certain passages, the exact pressure required for the delicate bell-like notes that gave the piece its name. By the end of the first week, she was playing it almost perfectly. She'd forgotten what this felt like. The complete focus required, where nothing else existed except the music and her hands and the piano. The way difficult passages that looked impossible on the page somehow worked when you practiced them slowly enough, breaking them into smaller pieces until your fingers learned the pattern. The satisfaction of finally nailing a section that had been giving you trouble. She'd forgotten how much she loved it. One night, around 2 a.m, she was deep into the most challenging section of the piece when she heard a sound behind her. She stopped immediately, her heart pounding, and turned to find her husband standing in the doorway in his bathrobe. "Sorry," she whispered. "Did I wake you?" He shook his head and came to sit on the couch behind her. "I've been hearing you every night. I didn't want to interrupt. I'm trying to keep it quiet. Claire, you're playing one of the hardest piano pieces ever written at 2 in the morning. Quiet is relative." He smiled. "You sound incredible, by the way." She turned back to the piano, her hands resting on the keys. "I didn't realize how much I missed this. Not the performing part, not the pressure. Just the playing. The challenge of it. So what are you going to do? When the performance comes?" That was the question she'd been avoiding. Claire had spent the last week and a half practicing obsessively, but she still hadn't decided what she'd actually do when she stood in front of that class. "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me wants to just play it perfectly and watch Professor Reynolds' face. He was so dismissive, you know. Didn't even look at me properly. Just assumed I was nobody. And the other part? The other part remembers why I left all of this behind. The moment I play that piece well, everything changes. People start asking questions. They want to know where I studied, who I trained with, why I'm not performing anymore. They look at me differently, expect things from me." Her husband was quiet for a moment. "You know what I think? I think you're afraid." Claire turned to look at him. "Afraid of what?" "Afraid that if you let people see who you really are, they'll want you to go back to being that person full-time. The concert pianist. The performer. And you're worried you might want that too, and then you'd have to choose between that life and this one again." His words hit closer to the truth than Claire wanted to admit. She looked down at her hands. "When Lily was born and we found out about her condition, the choice was easy. She needed me. Still needs me. I don't regret any of it. I know you don't, but Lily's doing better now. She's stable. Her doctor said last month that she's responding well to the treatment. She's not that fragile baby anymore. But what if something happens? What if she has a flare-up and I'm not there because I'm performing somewhere? What if nothing happens and you spend the rest of your life hiding who you are because you're afraid of what-ifs?" Claire didn't have an answer for that. Her husband kissed the top of her head and went back upstairs, leaving her alone with the piano and her thoughts. During the day, life continued as normal, but Claire noticed things shifting. At the next class, Professor Reynolds spent most of the time discussing the upcoming performances. He'd created a schedule and Claire's performance was last, saving the most ambitious for the finale, he'd said with a smirk that made it clear he expected it to be a disaster. Patricia approached her after class with genuine concern. "Have you been practicing? How's it going?" "It's going okay," Claire said noncommittally. "Just okay?" "Claire, that piece is nearly impossible. You know you can ask him to change it, right? It's not too late. Tell him you've been trying, but it's too difficult. He'll have to give you something else." "Maybe," Claire said, though she had no intention of doing that. The truth was, she could play La Campanella in her sleep now. Every note was exactly where it should be. Every trill was clean. Every leap was precise. She'd even started adding her own interpretive touches, the subtle dynamics and tempo changes that transformed notes on a page into actual music. But she still hadn't decided what she'd do on performance day. At home, Lily noticed something was different. One evening while they were doing homework together at the kitchen table, she looked up from her math worksheet and said, "Mom, why do you play piano in the middle of the night now?" Claire's pen stopped mid-sentence. "You can hear me?" "I'm sorry, honey. I thought I was being quiet. You are being quiet. But my room is right above the living room, remember? The sound comes up through the floor." Lily tilted her head. "You're really good. Better than the videos we watch on YouTube." "You think so?" "Yeah. How come you never told me you could play like that?" It was a simple question from a 12-year-old, but it struck something deep in Claire's chest. How come you never told me? Had she been hiding so much of herself that even her own daughter didn't know who she used to be? "I used to play a lot before you were born," Claire said carefully. "It was kind of my job, like a job. People paid you to play piano?" "Yeah, that's so cool." Lily's eyes lit up. "How come you stopped?" "Because when you were born, you needed a lot of help. You were sick a lot, remember? And I wanted to be there for you. I wanted to take care of you." Lily was quiet for a moment, chewing on the end of her pencil. "But I'm not really sick anymore. Dr. Morrison said I'm doing great." "You are doing great, so maybe you could play again." Like for real. Out of the mouths of children, Claire thought. Her 12-year-old daughter had just said what her husband had been hinting at for months, what Claire herself had been afraid to think about. That night she practiced again, but it felt different. She wasn't just preparing for a performance in some community center class anymore. She was reconnecting with a part of herself that she'd kept locked away, thinking it was gone forever or that she'd have to choose between being a pianist and being a good mother. What if she could be both? The second week passed. Other students in the class started performing their pieces. The retired gentleman played a shaky but heartfelt trumpet solo. The young couple did a piano duet that was more enthusiasm than skill. Patricia performed her Bach prelude with several mistakes but obvious dedication. Professor Reynolds gave each performance the same lukewarm response, pointing out errors and offering condescending advice. Claire watched him carefully. He genuinely believed he was the only person in the room who truly understood music, the only one with real knowledge and ability. The woman who'd been close to tears during the assignment announcement ended up performing a simple Schumann piece. She made it through with obvious nervousness, and when she finished, she looked like she might cry from relief. Professor Reynolds simply said, "Adequate. You'll pass." With each performance, Claire felt the weight of her own upcoming turn growing heavier. She'd made a decision, though she hadn't told anyone yet. Not her husband. Not Patricia. Not even herself, really. It was more like the decision had made itself somewhere deep inside her, while she played alone in the darkness night after night. She was going to play the piece. Not a simplified version. Not just the first page. Not fumbling through it with apologies. She was going to play it the way it was meant to be played. The way she'd played it in concert halls in Vienna and Tokyo and New York. The way she'd recorded it for an album that music critics had called technically flawless and emotionally resonant. Whatever happened after that, she'd deal with it. The night before her performance, Claire didn't practice at all. She'd learned long ago that rest was just as important as preparation. Instead, she sat at the piano bench with her hands in her lap and let herself remember. She remembered being 16 and playing this piece for the first time, thinking it was impossible. She remembered being 23 and performing it at her debut concert, terrified she'd make a mistake. She remembered being 28 and playing it for a recording, doing 17 takes until it was perfect. And now she was 35, about to play it in a community center classroom for an audience of 10 people and a professor who thought she was nobody. It should have felt like a step backward, but somehow it felt like moving forward into something new. Tomorrow, Professor Reynolds was going to learn something about assumptions. The morning of the performance, Claire woke up with butterflies in her stomach. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in over a decade, that mixture of nervousness and excitement that came before stepping onto a stage. She'd almost forgotten what it felt like. Her husband made her favorite breakfast, scrambled eggs with toast, though she could barely eat. Lily bounced around the kitchen, more excited than Claire had seen her in months. "Can I come watch you play, Mom? Please." Claire hadn't expected that. "It's just a class thing, honey. It'll be boring." "No, it won't. You're playing that really hard song. I want to see everyone's faces when you play it." Lily grinned. "Especially that mean professor you told Dad about." "I never said he was mean. You didn't have to. I could tell from how you talked about him." Her husband looked up from his coffee. "I think we should both go, if that's okay." "Support team." Claire felt tears prick at her eyes unexpectedly. For so many years, her performances had been solitary things. Even when she played for thousands of people, she'd felt alone on that stage. But having her family there, in that small community center classroom, felt different, more real somehow. "Okay," she said quietly. "But don't expect too much drama. It's just a class." Her husband and daughter exchanged a knowing look that made Claire smile despite her nerves. She spent the afternoon trying to distract herself. She cleaned the kitchen even though it was already clean. She folded laundry. She helped Lily with her homework even though it wasn't due until next week. Anything to keep her mind occupied. At 5 o'clock, she changed into dark jeans and a simple navy sweater. Nothing fancy. She looked at herself in the mirror and thought about all the performance outfits she used to wear. The elegant gowns, the carefully styled hair, the stage makeup. That person felt like someone from another lifetime. The community center was busier than usual when they arrived. Apparently, some students had invited family and friends too. The young couple's parents were there. Patricia had brought her sister. Even the retired gentleman had someone with him. a woman who looked like she might be his wife. Professor Reynolds was setting up the sound system, looking somewhat annoyed by the larger-than-expected crowd. He'd pushed extra chairs to the back of the room and repositioned the piano slightly to face the audience better. Claire chose a seat in her usual spot, middle row. Her husband sat on one side, Lily on the other. Her daughter kept squeezing her hand, practically vibrating with excitement. "Remember," Claire whispered, "this is just for fun. It's not like my old performances. Keep your expectations reasonable." Lily just smiled like she knew something Claire didn't. The performances began at 6 o'clock sharp. Claire had seen most of them already during previous classes, but watching them again with an audience present was different. People applauded warmly after each piece. Family members beamed with pride. Even Professor Reynolds seemed slightly more generous with his feedback, probably because there were witnesses. The room gradually worked through the performance list. A Beethoven piece, a simplified Chopin nocturne, a Mozart rondo that went fairly well until the performer lost their place near the end and had to start the section over. Patricia performed her Bach prelude again, this time with fewer mistakes than in class. She'd clearly been practicing. Her sister gave her a standing ovation, and Patricia's face flushed with pleasure. Professor Reynolds nodded approvingly and said, "Much improved from last week." The performances continued. Claire's nervousness grew with each one. She could feel her heart beating faster. Her palms were starting to sweat slightly. Lily noticed and squeezed her hand again. "You're going to be amazing, Mom." Finally, there was only one name left on the list. Professor Reynolds looked at his notes and then scanned the room until his eyes landed on Claire. "And for our final performance of the evening, we have Mrs. Claire Mitchell, who has bravely chosen to tackle one of the most challenging pieces in the piano repertoire." His tone made it clear he thought bravely was code for foolishly. As I've mentioned to the class before, this is an extremely ambitious selection, and I want to remind everyone that the educational value is in the attempt, not the execution. He was giving her an out, lowering expectations so thoroughly that anything she managed to play would be seen as an admirable failure. Claire could almost feel him mentally patting himself on the back for being so understanding. She stood up slowly, her legs slightly shaky. It had been so long since she'd performed for anyone other than her piano at 2 in the morning. Her husband gave her an encouraging smile. Lily whispered, "Go get him, Mom." Claire walked to the front of the room. The piano was a Steinway, which surprised her. It was nicer than she'd expected for a community center. Someone must have donated it. The bench was at the right height, and when she sat down, the familiar position felt like coming home. Professor Reynolds continued his introduction, speaking to the audience now. "The piece Mrs. Mitchell will attempt is La Campanella by Franz Liszt, which translates to The Little Bell. It's based on a theme from Paganini and is known for its extraordinary technical demands. Professional pianists train for months or even years before performing this piece in concert. We should appreciate Mrs. Mitchell's courage in, I'm ready whenever you are," Claire said quietly, cutting him off. Professor Reynolds looked slightly taken aback but nodded and stepped to the side. The room fell silent. Claire could hear someone's phone buzzing in the back. Someone coughed. The fluorescent lights hummed their eternal buzz. She placed her hands on the keys and took a deep breath. This was it, the moment where everything would change, where her careful invisibility would shatter. Part of her wanted to still play badly on purpose, to fumble through half a page and maintain her cover. But a bigger part of her was tired of hiding. She thought about Lily saying she wanted to see everyone's faces. She thought about her husband telling her she was afraid to let people see who she really was. She thought about 12 years of living small, playing quiet, being nobody. And then she began to play. The opening notes of La Campanella rang out, crystal clear and perfectly controlled. The delicate bell-like melody that gave the piece its name sang out from under her fingers. Already she could feel the shift in the room's energy. People sat up straighter. She moved into the first challenging passage, her fingers flying across the keys in rapid succession. The notes came effortlessly, each one exactly where it needed to be. This was the section that looked impossible on paper, where your hands had to move faster than seemed humanly possible. But Claire's hands knew these patterns like they knew how to tie her shoes. The piece built in complexity and volume. The playful opening gave way to thundering passages that required enormous reaches across the keyboard. Claire's hands stretched and leaped, hitting every note with precision. She wasn't just playing the notes correctly. She was making music, adding subtle dynamics and emotional nuances that transformed the piece from a technical exercise into something beautiful. She could hear it in the room now, the absolute silence that meant everyone was holding their breath. This wasn't the polite attention they'd given other performers. This was the stunned silence of people watching something they hadn't expected, something that didn't fit their understanding of the world. Claire reached the middle section, where the piece becomes almost impossibly delicate. The notes had to be light as feathers but perfectly controlled, each one distinct. This was where even professional pianists sometimes struggled. Her fingers danced across the keys, creating the effect of tiny bells ringing in different registers, high and clear and pure. Then came the final section, where the piece exploded back into virtuosic display. Rapid scales, enormous leaps, thundering octaves, the kind of passage that made audiences gasp in live concerts. Claire played it with the same effortless control she'd had in her 20s, her hands moving so fast they were almost a blur. She was no longer in a community center classroom. She was back in those concert halls, feeling that electric connection between performer and audience, that moment when music stops being sound and becomes something else entirely, something transcendent. The final notes rang out, the delicate bells fading into silence. Claire lifted her hands from the keys, and for a moment nobody moved. Then the room erupted. People were on their feet, applauding wildly. Lily was jumping up and down, shouting, "That's my mom." Patricia stood with her mouth hanging open. The young couple looked at each other in disbelief. The retired gentleman was shaking his head in wonder, and Professor Reynolds stood frozen near the piano, his face cycling through expressions faster than Claire could catalog them. Shock, confusion, embarrassment, realization. His face had gone pale, then flushed red. Claire stood up from the piano bench slowly, her legs still shaky, but for a different reason now. The adrenaline of performing, the rush of it flooded through her body. She'd forgotten this feeling. The pure joy of playing perfectly, of sharing something beautiful with other people, of being seen for who she really was. Patricia was the first to reach her, practically running across the room. "Claire, what on earth? Where did you learn to play like that?" Other students crowded around, all talking at once. "That was incredible. I've never heard anything like it. Are you a professional?" Through the crowd, Claire could see her husband and Lily making their way forward. Lily's face was radiant with pride. Her husband just smiled, and in that smile she could read everything he was thinking. "I told you so. I knew you could do it." "Welcome back." Professor Reynolds finally moved, walking slowly toward Claire as the crowd parted. His earlier confidence had completely evaporated. He looked like a man who just realized he'd made a terrible miscalculation. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, his voice tight. Where exactly did you study?" Claire looked at him for a long moment. The man who'd dismissed her without a second glance, who'd given her an impossible piece thinking she'd fail, who'd never once asked her anything real about her background because he'd already decided who she was based on how she looked and how she acted. "Juilliard," she said simply. "I graduated 20 years ago." The room fell silent again. The word hung in the air like a note that wouldn't fade. Juilliard. One of the most prestigious music schools in the world. The place where legends trained, where only the most exceptional talents were accepted. Professor Reynolds opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. "You graduated from Juilliard," he repeated slowly, like he was testing the words to see if they made sense. 20 years ago. "Yes, and you've been sitting in my introductory music appreciation class for a month saying nothing." Claire shrugged slightly. "I came here to learn, to enjoy music again without pressure. That's what I've been doing." Patricia grabbed Claire's arm, her eyes wide. Wait. If you graduated from Juilliard 20 years ago, that means you've been performing professionally, haven't you? Who are you exactly?" Before Claire could answer, the retired gentleman pulled out his phone. His fingers moved quickly across the screen, typing something. After a moment, his eyes went wide. He turned the phone to show his wife, who gasped. "Claire Mitchell," he read aloud. "Pianist. Debut album in 2008 titled Romantic Variations. performed with the Boston Symphony, the Vienna Philharmonic, and the Tokyo Metropolitan Orchestra. Winner of the Tchaikovsky Competition Junior Division at age 17. He looked up from his phone, stunned. There are videos of you playing at Carnegie Hall. The room exploded with noise again. Everyone started talking at once. Someone else was frantically searching on their phone. The young woman from the couple found something and showed her boyfriend, who let out a low whistle. You played at Carnegie Hall? Patricia's voice had gone up an octave. Carnegie Hall? And you've been sitting next to me this whole time acting like you barely knew what a sonata was? I never said I didn't know what a sonata was, Claire pointed out gently. I just didn't correct Professor Reynolds when he assumed I didn't. All eyes turned to the professor, who looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. His face had gone from red to a kind of pale gray. He cleared his throat several times before speaking. Mrs. Mitchell, I owe you an apology. The words sounded like they physically hurt to say. I made assumptions about your abilities based on nothing substantial. I assigned you that piece thinking it would be a learning experience, not realizing you were more than capable of performing it. I was condescending and dismissive, and that was wrong. The classroom was completely silent now. Everyone watched to see how Claire would respond. She looked at Professor Reynolds for a long moment. She could be angry. She had every right to be. He'd judged her without knowing anything about her. He'd set her up to fail, or so he thought. He'd been patronizing and rude, but looking at him now, seeing the genuine embarrassment and discomfort on his face, she found she wasn't angry. She was tired of anger, tired of proving things, tired of holding on to resentments. I accept your apology, she said simply, and I appreciate you saying it. Professor Reynolds looked relieved, though still deeply uncomfortable. May I ask why you didn't say anything? When I assigned you the piece, you could have told me about your background. I could have, Claire agreed. But honestly, I was curious what would happen. And I needed to prove something to myself, not to you. I needed to know if I could still play like that. If that part of me was still there after all these years. And is it? Patricia asked softly. Still there? Claire thought about the past 3 weeks. The late-night practice sessions. The way her hands had remembered every passage. The feeling of performing tonight, of sharing music with people again. Yes, she said. It is. Lily pushed through the crowd and wrapped her arms around Claire's waist. My mom's famous and I didn't even know it, she said, looking up with shining eyes. That's so cool. I'm not famous, honey. I was sort of known in classical music circles, but that was a long time ago. Why'd you stop? The young man from the couple asked. If you were that good, playing in all those places, why would you quit? Claire's hand moved to rest on Lily's head, stroking her daughter's hair. When Lily was born, she had some serious health problems. She needed a lot of care, a lot of attention. Someone had to be there for her, and I wanted that someone to be me. So I stepped away from performing. I thought it was temporary at first, but then it just became permanent. And I was okay with that. But you're still incredible, Patricia said, shaking her head in wonder. All this time you've been sitting there listening to me talk about going to one concert with Yo-Yo Ma, like I was some kind of expert. And you've actually performed with people like that. Your enthusiasm was genuine, Claire said warmly. That's worth more than technical knowledge sometimes. Her husband finally made it through the crowd and put his arm around her shoulders. I'm proud of you, he said quietly, just for her. Not for the performance, though, that was amazing. I'm proud that you were brave enough to share this part of yourself again. Claire leaned into him, suddenly feeling exhausted. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind a strange mixture of emotions. Relief, joy, nervousness about what came next, because something would come next. That much was certain. Over the following hour, as people slowly packed up and left, several students approached Claire with questions. The young couple asked for advice about practice techniques. The retired gentleman wanted to know about recordings she'd made. Patricia asked if Claire would consider giving private lessons. I don't know, Claire said honestly. I hadn't really thought about teaching. Well, think about it, Patricia urged. You clearly love music and you're incredible at it. Why keep that to yourself? Professor Reynolds approached as Claire was gathering her things. He looked older somehow, more humble. Mrs. Mitchell, I know I've already apologized, but I want you to know I've learned something important tonight. I've been teaching for over 30 years, and I've always prided myself on being able to assess a student's abilities. But I realize now that I've been judging people on surface things, Appearance, confidence, socioeconomic markers, not on who they actually are. We all make assumptions, Claire said. I assumed this class would be a safe place to be invisible. Turns out I was wrong too. Would you consider giving a guest master class? He asked. For the music department? We have students who would benefit enormously from learning from someone with your experience. Claire hesitated. A month ago, she would have said no immediately. But now, standing in this community center classroom with her daughter holding her hand and her husband beside her, and a room full of people who'd just seen her really play for the first time in years, she found herself considering it. Maybe, she said. Let me think about it. In the parking lot, as they walked to their car, Lily kept chattering excitedly. Mom, everyone at school is going to freak out when I tell them. Can I show them the videos? The ones of you playing at Carnegie Hall? If you want to, Claire said, smiling. And you should totally do that masterclass thing. And maybe start performing again. You're so good, Mom, you shouldn't hide it. She's right, you know, her husband said, unlocking the car. You don't have to go back to the life you had before with all the travel and pressure, but you could find a middle ground, teach, perform occasionally, share what you love. Claire got into the car and sat quietly for a moment, her hands resting in her lap. The same hands that had just played La Campanella perfectly. The same hands that had been making sandwiches and signing permission slips and braiding hair for the past 11 years. She'd thought those two versions of herself were incompatible. The concert pianist and the mother. The performer and the caregiver. But maybe they weren't. Maybe she'd been creating a false choice all along. You know what's funny? She said as they drove home. When I was performing all the time, I always felt like I was playing for other people. For critics, for audiences, for my teachers and mentors. I never felt like the music was really mine. And now? Her husband asked. Now I feel like it belongs to me. Like I can choose when to share it and when to keep it private. That piece I played tonight? I wasn't playing it to impress anyone or prove anything. I was playing it because I wanted to. Because it felt good. Because I love that piece. Lily leaned forward from the back seat. So are you going to play more? Like for real? Claire watched the streetlights pass by outside the window. She thought about Professor Reynolds' face when he realized who she was. She thought about Patricia's excitement and the young couple's admiration. She thought about how it felt to perform again. That rush of connection and joy. But mostly she thought about playing in her living room at 2 a.m, with no audience except the darkness and the streetlight and herself, finding her way back to something she loved, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Yeah, she said finally, smiling at her daughter in the rearview mirror. I think I am. The next week, the story had spread through the community center and beyond. Someone had recorded her performance on their phone and posted it online. It got shared on classical music forums and social media. People who remembered her from her performing days reached out. Music teachers asked her to give workshops. A local concert hall invited her to perform. Claire said yes to some things and no to others. She agreed to teach a weekly class at the community center. She accepted the invitation to perform one concert at the local hall. She declined an offer to tour internationally. She was building something new. Not her old life and not her quiet life, but something in between. A life where she could be a mother and a musician. Where she could be modest and talented. Where she could choose when to be invisible and when to let people see who she really was. Professor Reynolds did learn his lesson. He started asking students more questions, making fewer assumptions. He invited Claire to co-teach a session on performance anxiety and overcoming self-doubt. In his introduction, he told the whole story, including his mistake. I learned something valuable, he told his students. Never judge people by their appearance or their demeanor. Everyone has depths you can't see. Everyone has a story you don't know. The quietest person in the room might be the most extraordinary. And Claire, sitting at the piano ready to share her story, thought about how true that was, not just for her, but for everyone.